Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of 2013 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off mobile phones and Blackberries, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. We have apologies from Jim Hume today and apologies from Dick Lyle, and we welcome Rod Campbell and ask him to declare any relevant interests as a substitute.
No relevant interest.
Thank you very much. So agenda item 1, the Low Carbon Scotland meeting our emissions reduction targets 2013 to 2027. The draft second report on proposals and policies evidence session. The committee will take evidence on the Scottish Government's draft second report on RPP2 from Richard Lochhead, Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Environment. This is the final evidence session on RPP2, and I'd like to thank all those who attended the committee to give evidence and to those who submitted written evidence to help the committee scrutinise the report. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary. Good morning, George. And encourage him to introduce his officers, and if you have any short remarks to make at the beginning, we'd be happy to hear what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for inviting me here today to talk about the second draft report on proposals and policies for meeting Scotland's climate change targets. And can I also extend a belated welcome to Jane Baxter to the committee, given I've not been here before, but she's been a member, so it's good to catch up with all of you today, especially after a long week in Brussels, having negotiated to 5:30 a.m. yesterday morning, and now have the opportunity to come back to Parliament and talk about a very important issue. I hope you found your meeting yesterday very helpful with my ministerial colleague Paul Wheelhouse. I hope, obviously, today I can provide additional information about the sectors covered by the Rural Affairs and Environment portfolio and how that's contributing to our efforts to reduce Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions, in particular how the agricultural industry is responding to the challenge as well as other issues I'm responsible for. In many respects, reducing agricultural emissions offers farmers opportunities to work smarter and improve the efficiencies of their businesses. And a successful agricultural sector will continue to boost, of course, Scotland's thriving food and drink sector. And the Scottish food and drink sector is a priority, and it's a very important role to play in terms of delivering sustainable economic growth in this country. And indeed, I was pleased to be at the launch earlier this month of Scotland's Food and Drinks Environmental Ambition, as the document is called, for the industry, which recognises the importance of sustainability to that sector's future success. That's the ethos that underpins the Scottish Government's Farming for a Better Climate initiative as well. Through promotion of best practice across the agricultural sector, we are targeting avoidable emissions. Foremost amongst these is nitrogen loss to the atmosphere. That, of course, also contributes to other environmental outcomes, that initiative, such as improved water quality and biodiversity as well. So there's a whole series of win-wins by the agricultural sector in Scotland tackling this very important issue. We estimate that the uptake of the measures promoted through Farming for a Better Climate could result in savings to the industry of about £240 million over the period up to 2027. And the future, of course, offers the potential to do much more by exploiting the contribution to our climate change efforts that could come from developments in technologies such as precision agriculture, precision farming, where GPS, for instance, can guide the most effective use of fertiliser. Similarly, modern approaches to the use of nitrogen-fixing plants, such as clover and others, could help reduce the amount of a fertiliser that's required in the first place. So while the focus of RPP2 is reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland, Farming for a Better Climate also promotes adaptation measures, which helps farmers and land managers make their businesses more resilient to a changing climate. Best practice in managing wet soils, for instance, is certainly a case in point. And of course, you spoke to the Minister yesterday about our ambitions to continue to create new woodland across Scotland and to maximise the opportunities for locking more carbon into our soil by restoring degraded peatlands. This again is all part of the Government's approach to ensuring we use Scotland's natural assets in a holistic and sustainable way, reaping the benefits that they offer to us while taking care to protect them for future generations. Finally, I just want to say a few brief words about a zero waste plan, which is also an important factor in this debate as well. That's about designing waste as we know it out of our economy. And that will be achieved in many ways: recycling, designing products differently, packaging things differently, or not discarding valuable resources. and all these actions can save carbon. So in that sense, the Zero Waste Plan is also a carbon plan and a climate plan. But most of the carbon these actions will save is produced outside of Scotland. It's the carbon that's created extracting raw material from the earth, the carbon that's produced by manufacturing, and the carbon emitted when products and materials are shipped across the globe. So the Zero Waste Plan is making a major contribution to reducing Scotland's global carbon footprint. We estimate that the action in the Zero Waste Plan will directly help Scotland reduce its global footprint by 27% in terms of its waste footprint, and that was equivalent to 7 million tonnes of carbon. So the RPP we're talking about today, of course, is only a small part of the carbon story. The RPP is about the actions we're taking here in Scotland to reduce the carbon directly emitted in Scotland, and for waste, that would really be about landfill. So there's much more I could talk about. I very much look forward to today's discussion and doing my best to answer your questions. To introduce my colleagues here, I want to say I have with me Andrew Henderson from the Scottish Government's Directorate for Energy and Climate Change, David Barnes, on my right-hand side, Deputy Director for Agriculture and Rural Development, Antje Branding, who leads a team in Agriculture and Rural Development Division, and we have Stuart Gregg from the Waste team as well. So we'll all do our best working together to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to start off with the agriculture elements and ask, in the overall RPP2, why are there few policies in agriculture part of the rural land use section in the draft?
Well, clearly, there's a lot of ongoing work in relation to agriculture in Scotland and how we can reduce the carbon footprint of that sector. We have to, of course, bear in mind that agriculture and land use accounts for around 19–20% of Scotland's emissions, therefore it's got a major role to play. And not only has agriculture and land use got a major role to play in terms of changing some of the practices within those sectors to reduce the carbon footprint through doing things differently, but of course land use and agriculture can play a major role in terms of carbon sequestration and creating carbon sinks. So it's about reducing the impact on the carbon footprint in terms of the negative impact, but also having the ability to make a hugely positive impact in Scotland meeting its climate change ambitions. But the RPP2 document does talk about farming for a better climate. Now that is our major initiative at the moment, to engage with agriculture. There's a whole range of activity ranging from the land use strategy in Scotland to farming for a better climate and lots of other initiatives. But in terms of engaging with agricultural and land use, we very much see that as a vehicle to engage with the 20,000 agricultural holdings in Scotland to change the way we do things to reduce that sector's carbon footprint.
How many farms are signed up to farming for a better climate at the moment?
Well, in 2013 this year, we're going to carry out a survey to better understand how many farmers have engaged with this initiative. This is an initiative which promotes voluntary action and tries to transfer knowledge, tries to engage farmers around Scotland with the many different actions they can take. We reckon that several thousand farmers have engaged with farming for a better climate, but of course that's not all farmers in Scotland. It's an initiative that's only been running since 2010. We have 4 climate change focus farms up and running, which are equivalent to monitor farms, but they have a climate change focus. They very much share best practice, their focal points for farmers to get together to learn what can happen on farm, to reduce the carbon footprint. And again, several hundred farmers have attended events at these focus farms. So I think 2013 is a very important year to take stock of where farming for a better climate has got to, what we can do better to engage all of Scotland's farmers in the future. Indeed, the review of the Common Agricultural Policy at the moment offers another opportunity for that debate as well. So I think this year will be crucial to work out how many farmers have engaged and what we can do more in the run-up to 2027, but long before then, to make sure all farmers are engaged.
I see the examples from the RPP2 document around the country of different activities that people are involved in, and Farming for a Better Climate programme is delivering something at the moment. So when you say it's going to take stock in 2013, will we view the modest amount that's written in the RPP for the 2027 end point? And what policies or proposals has the Scottish Government considered for this line of work to be ramped up and why are these not in the draft RPP2?
Well, clearly it's a consultation at the moment on the document, and I'll listen very closely to the committee's comments today, and we'll reflect on that as we move towards publishing the final RPP2 documents. It's always a balance in terms of presentation. You know, what you include in these documents, what you don't include, because it's just, you know, if we spoke about everything that's happening within the Farming for a Better Climate, it would take up half the document, and we clearly are trying to just summarise that this is the central policy of agriculture in terms of this debate. But in terms of proposals, clearly, Farming for a Better Climate is taking the voluntary approach. The biggest area where agriculture can perhaps change its current practices is through reducing the use of nitrogen. As we know, the main emissions from agriculture and land use in Scotland, in terms of the overall debate, no doubt being about carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane, are the two gases which agriculture is largely or disproportionately responsible for.
On nitrogen and so
okay.
on, as we come along, but yes.
In terms of proposals, clearly within the document you see that we want 90% uptake of nitrogen efficiency measures by 2018, and that's one of our key proposals taking this debate forward.
Thank you for that. That tees things up just now. Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It's been claimed, Cabinet Secretary, that the Farming for a Better Climate programme is not sufficiently well monitored, and as a result it's difficult to assess the uptake of certain measures. Now, noting what you've said about the survey that's going to be carried out this year, is that criticism valid, and what reassurance can you provide the committee that the abatement from the programme is being measured accurately and will be in future?
Well, I understand those concerns, but we'll have to look at where we've come from and where we've got to. So clearly this was an initiative which was launched by the government in 2010. This is 2013. And if we look back over past decades, there haven't been such initiatives. This is a new way of doing things. It's a new initiative. It's pushing a very important debate in terms of climate change much further up the agricultural agenda. So it's very much a learning curve at the same time. And I think this is a good initiative. It was, you know, the current government came forward with it to engage with agriculture about how we can reduce our emissions and get all the win-wins at the same time, because by reducing emissions you can save each farm in Scotland a fortune, and it can cut costs dramatically if we get that right. So that's good for agriculture per se, not just in terms of reducing emissions. So we do have to monitor it. As I said, the plan has been to monitor it this year in terms of measuring the impact and surveying how many different farmers have actually engaged with the initiative. So this is quite an important year, as I said before, in terms of getting to that stage. But it's a bigger debate now. It's a really important debate, given some of the other pressures facing agriculture in Scotland at the moment, given the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, given the impact in the Scotland Rural Development Programme of reduced budgets. We have to give this a lot more attention to focus on how we can make farming more efficient or persuade more farmers to engage in doing things differently, because of these win-wins, as well as the fact we have this RPP2, which we have to put into place to achieve our ambitious climate change targets.
So essentially, the outcome of the survey will determine how you proceed?
Well, I will look at whether we need to refresh the initiative, whether we have to do things differently. But the first stage is to understand what impact it's had and to survey farmers themselves so we get their views and understand out of the 20,000 farm holdings in Scotland, and indeed crofters, how many people have actually engaged with it.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, can you...
just before you do, Claudia Beamish, on this point, was it? Right, very good. Yes.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. From what you've said and from what I've also heard about visits from farmers and attendance at the monitor farms on the open days, it is very encouraging, the interest. Is there any possibility of farmers doing on-farm assessments of carbon themselves? And I appreciate that's difficult, having been an eco schools coordinator, how hard that assessment is. But some of the things are quite straightforward, and you know, primary pupils can do some of them, and so I know that farmers will be able to as well, and it might just involve them in not to make any parallels. That might sound if I was doing that, but I do think it's really important that part of the engagement in the behaviour change is that farmers are able to take responsibility as well as doing the work? And lastly, is it really adequately funded going forward, this programme? Because it seems to me that this is the main programme that is there for farmers. And that's not to criticise the fact that it is the main programme.
Thank you. You raise a very interesting point there, which is how do we go about ensuring that every farm in Scotland has a carbon reduction plan? How do we carry out an assessment of the carbon footprint of every farm in Scotland? And I think that is a really good debate at the moment, and it's something I'm seriously thinking about. I know other countries tell me that they have carried out very brief, shallow assessments of individual farms, perhaps for marketing purposes in terms of green agriculture, so that in terms of the food that comes from those farms can have a sort of a green mark. And I think that is something we want to look at in this country as well. Something that's already happening. I mentioned in my opening remarks that the food and drink sector's got a sustainability strategy now, and the whisky sector have their own environmental strategy about reducing emissions. So they're looking at these issues already. But in terms of individual farms, I think that is something we should consider and work out how that could happen. You mentioned behavioural change, and I think that's clearly a key issue. What is the role of government here? It's clearly to make agriculture aware of the many benefits of changing some of the practices on farm to protect the environment, but also to cut costs. At a time when the cost of feed and fertiliser is rocketing, surely it's in the interest of each individual farm and business to unilaterally take some action to review their own business practices. And that's a bit of personal responsibility and business responsibility as well. It's not just for farmers, it's not just for the government to turn up on each individual farm's doorstep and demand that this and that happens. And so far, that's why we've taken a voluntary approach. So it's in the business interest of each individual farm to look at some of these issues they can take forward to reduce costs. But yes, we will review government expenditure on this programme. And yes, we will look at how best to encourage each individual farm to have a carbon reduction programme, a kind of business plan, taking into account carbon emissions. We have a working group, the Agriculture and Climate Change Working Group, so that's basically a stakeholder group with farmers, and we've asked them about these sort of issues, and that dialogue will continue.
Thank you. Back to Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, can you outline what work has been done to develop the Optimising Livestock Management work stream of the Farming for a Better Climate programme?
Well, that is a key plank of the Farming for a Better Climate programme. Clearly, given that one of the key gases produced by agriculture in Scotland is methane, that means we have to improve livestock management across the board. The Scottish Agricultural College, now the Scottish Rural University, have been heavily involved in this the last few years. And indeed, we have a world-leading research facility called the Green Cow Initiative, which is a research facility in Scotland where they look at the feed and what implications changing the feed can have on the levels of methane from livestock. And clearly that's to understand better how we can have better feed components and overall livestock management in terms of cattle. So the health of stock, breeding practices and feed all have a major contribution to the carbon footprint of livestock in Scotland. And these kind of areas are the focus of the Farm for a Better Climate programme. So there's a lot of work happening there.
Can I ask how engaged the industry is in this? Are you identifying buy-in to this type of work?
Yeah. There are lots of case studies from on-farm of where farmers have changed their practices and got good results. We know of one farmer who saved £3,000 just by changing the way he feeds his animals. I spoke to a dairy farmer who I sat next to at a dinner just a few weeks ago who told me that he'd cut his costs by 40% in terms of how he uses fertiliser, in terms of his feed for his animals. These are substantial reductions, and that was my point from earlier on, is in terms of trying to get the message across to agriculture, this is a win-win. If you want to make more profit and cut your costs, yes, you'll save emissions at the same time and help Scotland achieve our targets, but it's really in your own interest to look at this. So there are lots of individual case studies. But in terms of engaging individual farmers, I guess it just goes back to my previous answers. We're constantly striving to do that. All our farming organisations in Scotland are engaged in this debate. They're all speaking to their own members about the benefits of taking forward some of these changes, as well as the government's own initiatives.
Thank you very much. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to ask you about changing the behaviour of farmers and the challenge of communicating with 20,000 of them, but you've already alluded in your comments up to now about the fact that you yourself recognise that is a big challenge. We spoke yesterday with the Minister about the need to get buy-in from all the stakeholders and to raise awareness of the issues and to identify winners and losers and where possible, take them with you. So we discussed that yesterday. And you've indicated this morning that you're aware of all of that, but the document doesn't address much of that. It's a bit thin on the ground. There's not much reference to how that's going to happen. You've spoke about things that you're going to do, but they're not in the document. Have you got any comments to make on that?
Sure. Again, there's always decisions about what you put in the document, what you don't put in the document, because it's already 100 odd pages long. But I'll certainly take on board those comments. And what I would say is that because we have the renegotiation of the Common Agricultural Policy just now, and because there's a greening element of the new policy, so the proposal is that 30% of your payments has to be linked to greening measures. That's an opportunity to engage with the agricultural community, because if there's one thing that's going to engage all our farmers, it's the future support mechanisms. And therefore, that is a really good opportunity to engage all our farmers in this debate. Because if we're going to link the farming payments with greening measures, clearly that's just a direct link, and we have to use that hook. There's also the future of the new Rural Development Programme, and I want to focus more of that on carbon reduction measures. And again, as we take forward over the next 12 months, what the new Rural Development Programme will look like, we'll be really heavily engaged with all land-based industries, rural communities, environmental organisations, and of course farmers themselves. So that will also be an opportunity.
That all sounds really interesting and really useful. It just would be great to see some of it, just even a reference in the document would be...
The draft document, I'm happy to take away those comments.
Moving on to raising awareness within the public about the challenges ahead. The public expect to buy quality food at rock-bottom prices, and the recent revelations about horse meat have brought that to a head. And farmers are expected to deliver that within a low-carbon framework. Do you think the draft RPP2 delivers that?
Well, food miles within the food industry is clearly a growing issue. And the whole issue of the length of supply chains is currently in the news, and I'm on record as saying that we want to encourage more sourcing closer to home and shorter supply chains. It doesn't mean to say that when we go into our supermarkets or our shops or wherever, that we don't want products from around the world, just like every other consumer elsewhere in the world is going to enjoy. But where we can produce some of those products locally, clearly it would make sense to cut down the food miles and to have shorter supply chains, not just in terms of the carbon footprint, but also in terms of traceability, consumer confidence, supporting local economies. So there's a range of reasons there. In terms of the food sector, if we cut down the carbon footprint of the primary producers, then you're cutting down the carbon footprint of the food industry in Scotland. Also, as I said before, the food and drink industry have adopted a sustainability strategy, which I just launched a few weeks ago. The whisky industry over the last few years has adopted a carbon strategy. So everything from the amount of glass that's used in a bottle to how they produce the energy at the distilleries, all these issues are changing now. There's a phenomenal transformation taking place in the whisky industry that the committee might want to look at separately. This is not directly relevant, but it is relevant to what your question is about. But in terms of the food and drink industry, I believe that we can cut costs of producing food in Scotland through some of these measures. It's not a case of local food is more expensive. You have to import from overseas to get cheap food. I think we have to explode some of those myths. Yes, there are cost pressures in Scotland. Of course, there are higher fuel costs, etc. But in terms of reducing the cost of each business, that would hopefully displace the need to increase the price of food.
That was my concern. It's about the price. The costs are clearly important to the producers, but the prices to the consumers are an issue that concerns me, and the lack of choice for some families because of the cost restrictions.
Yes, and it's a huge debate, the future of food, and I'm currently thinking of a number of initiatives. We've had a food policy in Scotland now for the last few years, which I think has delivered fantastic dividends. We've got a local food revolution underway in Scotland at the moment, and we have more local sourcing from our retailers and food service sector than ever before. So there's been a lot of progress in the last few years, and we should recognise that. However, I think the current debate over food gives us an opportunity to move it forward even more quickly. And I'm very keen to engage with our food community in Scotland, with this committee, with Parliament, and I'm also going to bring forward a debate to Parliament in the next couple of weeks on this issue. So that'll give you an opportunity to discuss the future of food.
Briefly, Convener, that's really good to hear, and for what it's worth, I think that there's scope to work with educationalists and through schools and community centres to work with parents to help them learn about food and how to cook. Because it's all very well to be able to buy things, but if you don't know how to cook them, you can't reap the benefits of the revolution you're describing. So I think that needs to be also addressed.
Yes. Well, there are a new set of initiatives underway in food education in Scotland at the moment. We'll be launching more of those in the coming weeks. And there are some exciting ideas in that debate at the moment. I'm not pretending they'll all be easy to implement in terms of how you revolutionise food education in Scotland. But you're quite right in terms of making opportunities available for ordinary families to eat healthier, to eat more local. I think that's really important. We're also looking at the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, about what can be done in Glasgow in terms of the food debate. And we're looking at a food charter for the Games, so that people visiting the Games will have access to good local food. So please rest assured there's a lot happening, and hopefully if we have a debate in Parliament over the next couple of weeks, it'll give me an opportunity to update Parliament what is happening and also get more ideas from the Chamber, because I think all parties are signed up to this issue. And there's a lot of good ideas out there.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Graham Day.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just take you back a little bit to the behavioural change issue? Can I just clarify something? There's a document to be published next week on behavioural change. I'm wondering if there's anything in there about behavioural change for farmers, or if it's simply specific to the individual.
Can I ask Andrew to comment on that document?
Thank you.
We spoke about it with Mr. Wheelhouse yesterday, but it's not something which has a sectoral focus in the same way as the RPP document. It's a document which develops a set of themes and principles about effective behaviour change based on research about what works best and the kind of messages that should be embedded within policy making from the outset. And it's essentially introducing a kind of toolkit and way of approaching policy design, so that when we are developing things like, say, a refreshed look at farming for a better climate, or looking again at active travel, or whatever it might be, these kinds of themes and principles should be informing that particular policy making from the base up. So no, it won't say, here's a list of things for the agriculture industry, but it will be something which can be drawn upon when that work is being carried out.
So there is an agricultural aspect to it.
It can be used for that purpose, but it's not going to have an agriculture chapter or an energy chapter or anything like that. It's more an introduction of a toolkit, or a sense of principles that can be embedded within policy design.
All right, thank you.
Right, and moving along on the RPP2, Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As we're all aware, there's been changes made to the Common Agricultural Policy, and work on that is ongoing. Can you expand on changes made in the draft RPP2 as a consequence of changes to CAP, and explain how the Scottish Government will compensate for any changes? And in particular, if Pillar 2 and rural development funds are cut as a result of changes to the CAP budget, will the final RPP2 offer assurances that a future SRDP or equivalent will provide adequate funding for measures to lock carbon into soil?
Thanks for the two issues you've raised there. Clearly, the Common Agricultural Policy and European regulations have a major impact on what we're able to do in terms of engaging with agriculture in Scotland over reducing the carbon footprints and some of the measures we may wish to see happening in the future. So, for instance, the issue of achieving 90% take-up in nitrogen efficiency measures, because nitrogen is the big issue in agriculture. Previously, the RPP1 offered the route of cross-compliance, which is the conditions that farmers have to meet to receive their payments, as one way in which government could influence take-up of certain measures. The new Common Agricultural Policy will not give us that discretion, so national governments will not be able to influence the same degree, if at all, the cross-compliance measures. Therefore, we'd have to find a different way in which we can make take-up of these measures mandatory if we want to go down that route at some point in the future, as opposed to voluntary. And I mentioned before that part of the new CAP has got a greening dimension to it, which is something I support. I've supported since day one the concept of greening Pillar 1 of CAP, Pillar 1 being the direct payments to agriculture, direct payments to farms, as opposed to Pillar 2, which is wider rural funding. And what the debate is at the moment, and this is why it's not in RPP2, because we don't quite know where this is going to end up, because we were in the middle of a negotiation as RPP2 was formulated, so we couldn't put it in the document, is to what greening will look like. We've got a rough idea now, there's been some movement, and under the greening proposals of the new CAP, farmers will have to undertake a certain number of measures to qualify for the greening payment, which is 30% of the overall direct payment. So that's the number of crops that you have on farm. It's having areas set aside for ecological purposes, etc. What has been negotiated is that if some of the measures proposed are not appropriate for your country, then you can have equivalent measures. So you can have equivalent measures. And then we may have the opportunity, as part of this debate, the carbon reduction measures, to speak to agriculture in Scotland and say, well, what's in the regulation for CAP in terms of defining greening may not be appropriate for Scottish circumstances, but we have the opportunity of doing something equivalent that has the same outcome. Therefore, that may give us a route into having some carbon reduction measures. I should also make the point that since day one of the Common Agricultural negotiations, I've made the point to UK Government, to other Member States, European Commission, that carbon reduction should be a central feature of the greening and the new CAP. But I don't think it is, and I think that's quite disappointing. There may be indirect ways we can get that onto the agenda, but in terms of the greening measures, they're not overtly about carbon reduction. They're clearly related in terms of promoting the biodiversity, good environmental practice, which all has an impact on carbon emissions. But in terms of directly encouraging farmers to undertake specific carbon reduction measures, I think that's lacking from the CAP. But as I say, there may be indirect ways of getting that on the agenda. So that's that point. Second point is what help will be made available. Well, in terms of the Scotland Rural Development Programme, which I'm afraid is going to have a much smaller budget in the future under the budget deal agreed with the UK Government, and I'll be giving more details to Parliament shortly on what the actual budget consequences are for Scotland from the recent budget deal. But we went into that budget negotiation with the lowest Pillar 2 funding in the UK and the lowest in Europe. So not only do we have the lowest in Europe, we have the lowest in the UK of the devolved administrations in the UK Government. And unfortunately, it looks like the outcome of the recent budget negotiation may be even worse. So not only will we still be bottom, and this is still to be verified, I can't give an exact guarantee to the committee of what the outcome will be, but the indication is that we're not just as in a bad place as what we were before, but probably the worst place. So we have to focus much better with our limited budget for the new rural development programme, is my key point here. If we've got a smaller budget, we have to really focus as a country what do we want out of this rural development programme? And my view at the moment, which we'll take to stakeholders, is one of the key planks of it has to be reducing the carbon footprint of land use agriculture and rural Scotland. Not just because of achieving our targets, but because of the other benefits we talked about earlier. So that's where that's going.
Thank you. With regard to your earlier point regarding greening through Pillar 1, would it be fair to say that progress in the last few weeks has been to Scotland's benefit compared to where we were just 2 or 3 months ago?
Yes, I think we've moved forward considerably on the greening proposals. We had greening proposals which were effectively designed to tackle monoculture in some parts of Europe, where you can look out a window and as far as the eye can see, you'll see the same crop, you know, into the distance for several miles. And that clearly is not necessarily the best arrangement for the environment. In Scotland, we're completely different. We have clearly arable farmers in Scotland, and we have barley crops in the whisky sector, yes. But overall, the picture of Scotland is 1 million miles or 1 million hectares from what you're seeing in Europe, in some countries. Therefore, we don't want measures designed to tackle the monoculture in these countries being foisted upon farmers in this country. So we were seeking a much greater flexibility and much greater account of Scottish circumstances. So we've got extensive grazing, we've got hill farms, you know, most of Scotland's farming, or most of Scotland's land, sorry, is on poorer land and grazing quality. It's not extensive farming. Sorry, it's not intensive farming, it's more extensive farming. So we've now got greater flexibility to take into account Scottish circumstances. The thresholds which you have to reach to have the 3 crops are greater, which will give us much greater flexibility, and less people will qualify for having to adhere to those conditions. Some of the regulations will be in a more of a sort of parish basis as opposed to individual farm, which gives us much more flexibility for how we measure that and how it's implemented. And of course the equivalence measure, which means that if you don't want to use some of the measures proposed in your country, but you want to come up with something that gives the equivalent outcome, clearly that gives us much more flexibility to look at alternative measures. So I think we're much further along the road to having what Scotland needs out of that.
Okay, Owen, back to the RPP2. Alec Ferguson.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just start by saying how welcome those last few remarks are from the Cabinet Secretary, because I think the original proposal, I'm sure we all agree, were entirely unsuitable to Scottish conditions, and I'm really pleased to hear that. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the role that methane gas plays in the problems that we have, and I have to congratulate him on the delicacy with which he chose the words to describe the production of that particular substance. But it is a problem, and as he rightly said, what you can directly do about it is not an easy one to come up with. And with great respect, I suspect that looking at diets and that sort of thing may have an effect, but I rather doubt it'll be a major one in terms of the problem that methane presents itself. Now, anaerobic digestion played quite a part in RPP1, and for various reasons, I think largely to do with the expense, there wasn't a huge take-up throughout the industry. And I just wonder whether that was considered in RPP2 and what, if the Cabinet Secretary would like to say anything on why it hasn't been included in RPP2.
Well, anaerobic digestion clearly offers a big opportunity for Scotland, particularly dealing with our food waste, and also on farm, which has been something which many farmers have explored in recent years. There has, to a certain extent, been a situation where the anaerobic digestion within the RPP1 has been overtaken by events, in that it's now much more economical for farms to not rely on Scottish Government grants for anaerobic digestion, but to use the feed-in tariffs and other incentives that are there. And given that you cannot have both benefits from the government, you can't have a grant and take advantage of the feed-in tariffs, farmers are now saying, well, the feed-in tariffs give us a much better return, and therefore we took the decision that as far as what we can contribute to anaerobic digestion, there's much less of a role in RPP2 in terms of direct government support from Scotland, when the other incentives are where the industry is going to go. So that's essentially the reason why it's not in there. There are still support mechanisms for anaerobic digestion, but they will be much less attractive to farmers to apply for.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you very much. On a different topic, we did hear concerns in evidence about the adequacy of the monitoring uptake and coverage of the nitrogen efficiency measures that you've referred to before. RSPB have suggested that there should be a clear route map for the introduction of these measures by all farmers, including the timing and also regulatory trigger. And I just wonder if we could have your... I don't want to, in asking this question, I don't want you to think I'm actually supporting this, but I would be grateful for your comments on that suggestion.
Well, I want to strike a balance, albeit I think it's too early to rule anything out. I think the balance that we have to think about here is how do we encourage every farm in Scotland to have a carbon reduction plan on farm? And many are doing that already. Just pick up any edition of Scottish Farmer or some of the trade press now, and it's phenomenal how they've changed over the last couple of years. About half of the paper now is all about renewable energy. It's a big, huge supplement. And that's just such a change from, say, 5 or 10 years ago. And that shows how the mindset of many farmers has changed. They're looking for opportunities to cut costs, to reduce their carbon footprint, to source their own energy, etc. And that's very encouraging. So we want to encourage every farmer to have that plan in place like the RSPB and others want to see. But clearly, do I want to go on every farm and force lots of regulation through for more paperwork, for more bureaucratic hurdles, etc., etc.? Well, clearly, we'd want to avoid that if possible. And therefore, finding a way in which we can engage with every farmer in Scotland, persuade them this is their interest to do this, as well as the interest of the environment and the Scottish targets, is clearly a much better way forward. So that's my preference. But I think the outcome we want to see is every farmer in Scotland having that kind of plan. That's the outcome. So while I can't sit here and rule anything out in terms of the next few years, because we're talking about an RPP2 that goes up to 2027, I'm not going to rule anything out at this point, because if we get to the stage that that's not happening, we may have to look at other means. But the outcome I think we should focus on is that we'd like to see every farm in Scotland having a carbon reduction plan and reducing their carbon footprint.
I think if I may just finalise that, probably what's really behind my question is you've referred to, or the RPP2 refers to the desire of 90% of farmers to take up this plan. Have you yet thought of what Plan B is if that doesn't look like happening? I think is.
Well, Plan B would be mandatory, take up. That would be Plan B. I mean, that's just up front about that. I mean, we've not ruled that out. That's what I'm saying. At the moment, we've taken the voluntary approach. We've discussed already Farming for a Better Climate, and what's the next stage of that? How do we survey it? How do we monitor it? And that may give us some evidence that we have to do things differently.
Carrots and sticks, I think, are interesting.
Carrot first was what I was thinking.
Indeed so.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Claudia Beamish had a supplementary, I think, on anaerobic digestion.
Yes, thank you, Convener. It was slightly broader than that, Cabinet Secretary. Your remarks about carbon reduction in relation to the commitments that you've made are, I think, very helpful in terms of our climate change targets, and for better farming, and for farmers to be able to have more of a profit, indeed, if they do it right. I wonder if there's any possibility in the RPP2 of highlighting those which perhaps even couldn't be put as a proposal in relation to Pillar 1 CAP and SRDP, because the negotiations are ongoing. But it is, quite a marker that you've put down, and I wonder whether there's any space within the final document. Well, space is a question as well, but if there's any possibility of considering that.
Well, I would say yes, there is a possibility, simply because we have the next few months to finalise the RPP2 document, and we will be in a much better place to understand the role the new CAP will play. Therefore, that gives us an opportunity to perhaps say a bit more. So I'll certainly think about that, and it's certainly a possibility.
Okay, thank you. Can we move on to Nigel Donn? Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to just carry on the thoughts about nitrogen efficiency. Can I start, please, by just drawing your attention to a couple of lines on the table on page 167, which I think you'll be familiar with. The Farming for Better Climate is a steady rise in numbers from 50 to 107. Makes perfectly good sense. However, a few lines below the the 90% uptake of fertiliser efficiency measures goes from 0 to 260 between 2017 and 2018. Now, we had a very helpful comment from Mr. Henderson yesterday on the way that some of these figures have been put together from the bottom up, and I did listen, and I was grateful for that. But can I suggest that a step change like that, whilst I can understand where it may have come from, probably isn't terribly credible in the context, and I think that's a thought you might just like to consider in the final product, is whether there will just be a step change in 2018. Now, maybe there will be, so my question, I guess, is can you defend that step change? But if you can't, then presumably we're realistically looking at something which does change over time.
Well, clearly what this relates to is, as you've just said yourself, is the step change in that what the RPP2 says is that by 2018 we want 90% take-up of nitrogen efficiency measures by farmers. So that's reflected in that table. That's why it's such a step change. What we need to understand over the next 2 or 3 years is to what extent we can rely on a voluntary approach to achieve that, or whether we have to go to the mandatory approach. So the table is outcome focused. It's saying we need to get to there in 2018. And just further to my previous answer to Alex Ferguson, like so many things in the RPP2, we're talking about years into the future. 2018 is not that far away compared to 2027, I understand that, but you know, it's a fluid situation, and what we're laying down in RPP2 is our policies and proposals. We have to make those happen. And that's why we have this debate just now, whether it's voluntary or mandatory. So the plan B, as I said before, to get to 2018, if the voluntary approach is not working, is we'd have to look at mandatory measures.
But you would accept that that process will involve some numbers before that, which will be positive. So you're 0 in 2017. Whilst it makes sense in the context in which you just said it, presumably there will be some abatement ahead of that because some farmers will voluntarily be doing the right things.
What we have done, I'll bring Andrew in a second, because maybe, hopefully I'll preempt his answer, that would be a good sign. What we have not got is the data for a lot of these issues. As I said before, it's quite a learning curve. There's a lot of work underway to understand what's happening with fertiliser. We do know there's been a massive reduction in agricultural emissions, more than the rest of the UK and more than the average in Europe since 1990. That's due to doing things differently in this country, just the way that agriculture's gone since 1990 in this country. But clearly over the last few years, and since the climate change targets were adopted by the Parliament, and Farming for a Better Climate was up and running, you know, we're gathering that data in to understand what impact there has been. So maybe we'll be able to populate some of those years with data as we get the advice. But we've taken quite a conservative approach to this document. I know, you know, governments are quite often accused of, you know, trying to be ambitious and put in, you know, inflated numbers because we want to be really ambitious and make sure we can show we get our targets. But if you look at RPP1 and RPP2, you know, a lot of the data has been revised, and you know, we take a very conservative approach because if we don't have evidence of what's been achieved, we don't want to put that in that document. I don't know if Andrew was going to come in.
It was just that's quite an important point about the evidence, and we've touched on it before at this committee on a few occasions, and again yesterday with the Minister and today with the Cabinet Secretary, about the data changes all the time, and it has been quite a task in the preparation of the draft RPP2 in arriving at what we believe is the kind of credible point at which you fix the numbers to put them into the document, because a month's time things will change. In terms of that specific point about uptake of the nitrogen efficiency under Farming for Better Climate, and it refers again to my point yesterday about sometimes you just have to pick a date at which you start counting the abatement. But within the numbers for Farming for a Better Climate policy line, there is an assumption about a growing uptake of nitrogen efficiency up to the sort of maximum we believe that could be achieved under a sort of general voluntary approach. The jump under the proposal is the step change to full compliance or close to full compliance under a mandatory framework. So clearly you have a gradual approach under Farming for a Better Climate in the policy line, and then the step change under the proposal line, at which point it will be required to do these things rather than just recommended and encouraged. We did anticipate the possible confusion over the complexities of these numbers. So there's a specific section on this particular point within the technical annex to RPP2. So if you look at page 66 of the technical annex, there is a specific discussion about how those numbers were arrived at. And that's even the technical annex is the short version. So we can get into this should the committee wish to really explore, but hopefully there's enough there to give the gist of how these numbers were arrived at.
Thank you for that very gentle telling off, which I respect. I'm just wondering if we could get back to the basic biology of this then. Your previous comments, Cabinet Secretary, suggest that maybe we're going to have different crop rotations, and rather than putting expensive nitrogen into the ground, we'll let the plants do it for us. Are we seriously looking at a situation where we plant more clover and alfalfa and get that into rotations in the way it used historically to be done?
There are kind of two separate issues there. The three-crop rotation, as proposed as part of the Common Agricultural Policy, is clearly about biodiversity. There may be clearly implications for emissions, but that's kind of a different issue to what we're speaking about here with nitrogen. There are two issues with nitrogen in Scotland, is that if there's too much nitrogen put on the ground through agricultural practices, clearly that can lead to pollution effectively due to runoff into watercourses. And as you know, we have nitrate vulnerable zones in Scotland through the Nitrates Directive, and that is trying to curb that pollution, because that's not good for our water quality, it's not good for biodiversity, etc. And if too much nitrogen is put on the crop and it goes into the air, well, that's your nitrous oxide, and that's your very powerful gas, which contributes towards global warming. So it goes into the air, it goes into the water, and that's why we want to be more efficient at the nitrogen we use. And that's why many farmers at the moment are doing a lot of good things to become more efficient with what they use, not least because the cost of nitrogen is rocketing, or fertiliser is rocketing. So these are two areas we have to target, and that applies across all agriculture that uses fertilisers. Or indeed, there's a livestock dimension to this as well. So the three-crop rotation from the Common Agricultural Policy is kind of separate to that. The good news is that the amount of fertiliser used in Scotland has declined substantially in recent years. That's one of the reasons why Scotland's emissions have gone down in agriculture much more than elsewhere. Maybe less crops been sown in Scotland compared to elsewhere, less need for fertiliser. And also that the amount of fertiliser used in tilled land, I'm told, is reduced by 16% over the last 10 years alone to 2011. So there is a reduction in use of fertiliser, and I expect the statistics in the next few years will show a further decline.
The point about the efficiency measures and the targets for the Farming for a Better Climate is that the programme looks as though there might be some double counting issues here in the way that the statistics have been presented. Are there?
We go to great lengths to avoid double counting, and I'm not sure, because we were discussing this, the sort of technical reasons why this does not happen. Yeah. We were discussing that in terms of the... Yeah.
Sorry, Antje, do you want to? Yeah.
We are aware of the fact that the two policies, Farming for a Better Climate and 90% uptake of nitrogen efficiency, that there is a potential for double counting, which is why we specifically addressed it. And it is set out in the technical annex on page 66 under policy interaction. and it specifically sets out the way we've gone about in doing that. I'm not quite sure how much detail you want me to go into just now, but it specifically addresses the point that we actually have avoided the double counting. And equally then there is a policy interaction possibly with double counting between farming for a better climate and the nitrogen efficiency measures, but also with the other proposal, agricultural technologies. Again, the technical annex sets out how we specifically address that problem.
Thank you for that. That allows us to reference it, even if it's a very technical explanation. We can always ask questions if we require to, but it's useful to know. Nigel Don, did you have another question?
Did I? Was I expected
Number
to
12.
do- Sorry?
The 12th question. Have you covered it?
I think that's covered, actually.
Okay. So we're going to move on to the next one. Is Alec Ferguson going to lead in that? No?
Oh, well, I'm happy to ask a question. I thought you were discouraging from
No.
Given
expressed an interest in asking.
Well, I'm grateful for that.
Technical potential.
To be fair, we did cover this in some detail yesterday. But Minister, Cabinet Secretary, I just wanted to look briefly at on page 167 of the table on rural land use. We had a long discussion yesterday over the section on additional technical potential from low carbon land use, given the fact that it's heavily backloaded in 2025, 26 and 27, but in those 3 years produces the greatest abatement figures of all. And I'm still not entirely clear as to given the use of the word potential, one has to suspect that this is to a degree an aspirational target. And I just wonder if it's possible to put any more detail on how that high level of abatement can be achieved for something that is really an aspiration at this point.
Clearly the big challenge we face with the document that takes us out to 2027 is how can we sit here in 2012, 2013, when this document's being written, and predict exactly what technologies will be available, what other factors will influence land use, agriculture, especially given the climate change we're experiencing. But at the same time, we have our targets which Parliament signed up to, and we know we have to be very ambitious to achieve those targets. So for that reason, we have to focus, and we have to say, if we look at Scotland as a country in terms of land use and agriculture in this context of this debate, where can we be transformational and do things differently compared to what we've done before that will have an impact on our targets? So we have to balance all these factors, and it is very challenging doing that in 2013, looking ahead to 2027. So that's the origins of these proposals. If you look at peatland, we now know, we've learned a lot more about it, and we're now much more focused on how we manage our peatlands going into the future. And as we learn more about the science behind carbon in Scotland and how we can achieve targets, and working with the advisors, the various scientists and the Climate Change Advisory Group, etc., we now know that that's got a major role to play in terms of our accounting. So that's why peatland is now going to be a major transformational policy. And the recent budget, as you know, kicked off some funding towards peatland restoration over the next 3 years. And we've committed to making that a much bigger focus in a decade or two ahead. And in terms of technology and agriculture, what we've seen in the last few years is some phenomenal advancement in the technology that can be used on farm to have precision farming, to work with our soil, to make sure the fertilisers apply to the right parts of the field, etc. So we are putting a lot of stock on technology in terms of agricultural practice for the future, because we do think we have to maximise that for Scottish agriculture, and that will offer huge benefits in terms of how we achieve some of the other issues we're speaking about, the use of fertiliser, etc. So that's really the focus behind that, and clearly there's other issues I could discuss, like woodland cover and forestry, which has been taken forward as well. So that's where we're coming from, and that's just our best estimates of how we can plug those gaps in the future. That may change in RPP3 in 2016 or whenever that's published, and 2016, we'll be publishing documents looking at 2027 or beyond, as that will have to do. So, you know, again, the debate will change again. So we're just working a whole variety of areas at the moment we know about and where we think there's massive potential.
I mean, I'm grateful for that. And if I may, very briefly, Convener, I don't disagree with anything. And I fully appreciate the difficulties in trying to forecast these things. It's very difficult. And it is right that challenging targets are set. As I said, I think in the debate, it's much better to set challenging targets and miss them than easy targets so that you can say that you've achieved them. I think that's the right balance. But I do just voice a word of caution, because and I know we don't deal with transport here, but in the table on transport, there's a similar loading on the last 3 years of, again, potential improvements that also come to the same figure as this one I'm referring to. And if you add those two figures together, it actually comes to 11% of the total abatements over the whole RPP2. And I just think that that's quite a high figure to put on a potential saving, which is sort of largely aspirational in nature, however well-founded that might be. And I just have a sort of question mark above my head of whether that isn't sort of opening up a bit of a hostage to fortune in the future.
And, you know, I can understand that, because clearly we sit there looking at the projections for 2027 and have similar concerns and think, well, you know, this is very challenging, but what's the alternative? There might not be an alternative. We have to meet the challenge, and we've taken the decision as a Parliament to do that. Agriculture and land use accounts, as I said before, for about a fifth of emissions in Scotland, therefore it's got a big role to play in the future. And we have to find some ways of being transformational within that, if that fifth, you know, is to play its role. So that's also a key consideration.
Okay.
Thank you for that. All right, we're going to move on to waste and resource efficiency for a change. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the committee has heard that the waste and resource efficiency section of the document relates mostly to dealing with waste rather than reducing it in the first place. And so I'm wondering why the importance of the waste hierarchy is not reflected in the RPP2. And are there more proposals and policies which could be included in the final document to address this concern? I accept that that might involve looking at supply chains and behavioural change. I seem to always end up talking about behavioural change, but there are other things that can be done to reduce rather than focusing on how we dispose of waste.
Yes, and our ambitious Zero Waste Scotland policy that we adopted a few years ago is very ambitious in itself in terms of reducing the amount of waste that we produce in this country, what we recycle and what we reuse. Again, you know, the RPP2 is focusing on the cause of emissions, which is, in the case of waste, is landfill, in terms of, you know, the vast majority of emissions in the waste industry. In terms of these figures, is the methane from landfill. And again, that's a much more powerful gas than other gases, and that's why it's got to be tackled. But again, there's been a massive reduction since 1990 of methane from landfill in Scotland. And that's doesn't mean it's not a big challenge ahead in terms of our waste industry. We have consulted on what our target should be for reducing waste in Scotland. So there's two things there. Firstly, we expect that the amount of municipal waste per person will fall by 13% between 2010 and 2014, largely because of the recession. Now, that's not directly answering the question about targets, but just for background to this debate, in terms of the amount of waste produced, we expect that to go down by 13% over that period because of economic factors. Yes.
Consumption, yeah.
We're looking at a target which we consulted upon of reducing waste produced by 15% by 2025. So it's fair to say in the past we've not had targets specifically for reducing the amount of waste we produce in the first place as a country, but we have been looking at that as part of our Safeguarding Scotland's Resources consultation recently, which also looks at a lot of other measures about reducing waste, be that single-use carrier bag taxes or levies, or other measures which are currently in the mix at the moment. I mean, I could talk about waste for a long time. I think hopefully that just addresses your particular point.
Some cross-reference perhaps into this document. I know you don't want to write screeds and screeds, but you're telling us good things this morning and they're not in the documents, so I would just make that comment.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you think they're good things. But clearly it would amount to another 100 pages if we were to put them all in the whole waste plan and the whole Farming for Climate.
Yeah.
So just trying to focus on what the RPP2 is about. But, you know, I'm also listening very closely to your comments, what more could be done to put in the document.
Would you like to comment on the view expressed to the committee that emissions reductions targets from the waste sector are heavily reliant on policies that existed before 2010?
Well, I would like to comment on that, because we've had a number of consultations just in the last year or two, safeguarding Scotland's resources, and of course we put through Parliament the waste regulations, that was 2012, yes. And the waste regulations, you know, it's worth conveying to the committee, again, they're very radical and ambitious. The waste regulations will ban certain materials from going to landfill. Biodegradable materials will not be able to go to landfill by 2021. No other part of the UK has adopted that policy. So that's, you know, within a few years, we'll be in a position where that's just not allowed to go to landfill. There are other measures within the waste regulations as well about what can go to incineration. So that's constrained, and other measures. So this was all going to kick in terms of food waste collections. I think just under a third of homes will have a food waste collection service, either at the moment or within the next year or so. Including, is it Fife? You'll know about Fife. Well done to Fife, they've led the way on a number of these issues. So that's a huge step forward from where we were just a few years ago in terms of food waste collections. Again, that's addressed in the regulations introduced in 2015, etc. Going to be collected from businesses. We can't put to incineration certain materials, etc., etc. So that's not all pre-2010, that's all post-2010, and that's all going to play a major role in reducing emissions in Scotland.
Thanks, Gavina.
Right. Alec Ferguson.
Well, just really following, thank you, Gavina, just sort of following on from that, we were told by one witness that effectively all the low-hanging fruit in that regard has already been picked, and his concern was that RPP2 only contains one additional measure on one additional waste proposal, which is that of methane recovery, which, as I think we've already discussed, is a bit of an inexact science. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us whether any other measures were discussed in drawing up RPP2, and effectively, what, you know, again, what is Plan B in all of this?
Well, again, because over 92% of emissions from a waste arise from landfill, and because the RPP2 is focusing on specific measures to reduce emissions, that's why that is the proposal or policy within the document for waste. There's clearly other issues mentioned under waste in the document of what's happening, and some of them I've referred to already. So, if we reduce that 92%, there may not be a requirement for Plan B. You know, if you take that argument to the extreme. But I also mentioned the impact that waste in this country can have on the global footprint. So we're contributing through our zero waste plan to the world's global footprint. And also in Scotland, our biggest challenge is methane from landfill. So we can tackle that. That's the big prize under the waste agenda. Albeit, you know, there are other things that have to be done, we are doing.
Can we move on to Rod Campbell?
Morning, Cabinet Secretary. I've heard your comments on economic recession, plastic bags, and of course the successes in Fife on food waste collection. But what would you say to the general comment that the reduction in waste per person are based on assumptions rather than evidence-based?
Well, any data we use in the document is, you know, thoroughly evidence-based. But clearly, when the debate around some of the issues we're discussing is around behavioural change, it's around new measures that have been put in place to deal with what we've traditionally called waste in Scotland, but now we're seeing as a valuable resource. And that's a key point. So We have to distinguish between what's traditionally just seen as being something that goes in landfill, waste, to something that's a valuable resource which can be recycled or reused. So, for instance, I was in IKEA for the first time in a few years just last week, and I didn't go to I wasn't eating anything in the canteen, but it would have been perfectly safe to do so. But I wouldn't have been able to get their meatballs. It would have been this week if I'd gone this week. And I was launching a new pilot scheme we've got in Scotland, which we're funding through Zero Waste Scotland, of reverse vending machines and deposit return schemes. So the bottle or the can, which may have at some point in the past gone into landfill, in the future will hopefully be recycled. It will hopefully go into these machines, or deposit return, or be collected from the doorstep at our homes or our businesses. So that waste per person that's being produced will decline, because that's a valuable resource. It's not going to landfill, it's being recycled. We're not there yet. Many other countries are miles ahead of where we are in terms of collecting our bottles and cans, etc., for recycling. But I'm hoping to persuade the committee there are some measures in place now to change the way we do things in Scotland. And so that reverse vending machine, you can go into IKEA, and various other businesses are piloting that in Scotland for us, and you can put your can or bottle into the machine and you can get a voucher back, or you can give 10p to charity. And therefore, I think that's a good way to do things in the future. We are ahead of many countries in doing this, but there are many countries ahead of us, and we have to catch up with them. That's certainly my ambition. As we all know, some of the Scandinavian countries have collection rates of 90–95% for their cans and bottles, and we are much lower than that in Scotland. I'll ask Stuart to remind me, is it about a quarter, give or take, I think?
Well, we're recycling about 40, just over 40% at the moment.
Of all recycling?
Yeah.
But in terms of cans and bottles?
Yeah, it varies between local authorities, but yeah, some are doing better than others, 20 to 50 sort of range.
So as a country, we're not collecting enough bottles and cans, as an example. So hopefully the waste per person will decline, and that's why we want these targets in place, and that's why we're putting all the other measures in place to make sure that our waste is seen as a valuable resource.
Could I ask you a more specific point, which is raised in evidence by Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, that abatement levels attributed to zero waste policies for each year between 2013 and 2022 has increased by between 2 and 4 times the abatement attributed to the same policy in RPP1 without any clear explanation. Can you comment on that?
Well, I'll ask Andrew to comment in a second, or Stuart, but essentially we've updated the data. RPP1 had the data we had available at the time and the scientific input and the research input, and our advisors, who are, as you know, they advise government, the various what's the word I'm looking for, the groups of scientists in the universities, the analysts, that's the word I'm looking for. They have been updating all that information since RPP1, and it's the case that we've had to change a lot of the figures through RPP2 to reflect up-to-date science and up-to-date information we're getting. So it's purely just updating the information. And we'd much rather be accurate. And, you know, if it means saying that there are more emissions from something than what we thought was the case, we'll put that in the document. And that's why RPP2 is different to RPP1 in some cases.
Possibly a case for kind of footnotes by way of explanation, more in the document?
Yes, I don't know, do you want to, Stuart, comment on what information we can give on that?
I'll add a little bit. I mean, what we're talking about, I think, was something like 300–400 odd landfill sites across Scotland. We don't know what's in those landfill sites, stuff that's buried years ago. So there's quite a few assumptions have to be, used to try and work out how much methane's been emitted. And the methane's emitted from these things for decades as well. So we're trying to understand how that changes over time. I can assure the committee, it's internationally recognised methods that are employed here, and they're reviewed and peer reviewed. The reason it's changed is partly to do with the fact of the recession. So that meant there was less stuff going to landfill. It's partly to do with we've got food waste collections rolled out across Scotland, so that's reducing what's going into landfill sites, and it's partly to do with just slightly more sophisticated methodology being applied. So it's a combination of these things why it's changed.
Okay, thank you.
Given that there's talk in paragraph 8.6.2 on page 140 of the draft It says, through Zero Waste Scotland, we are mapping out the opportunities for enhanced gas capture across Scotland. The final report will provide the basis from which to make the future policy decisions required to achieve the abatement potential. I take it that that wraps up what you're going to explain in a bit more detail, and that indeed the capturing of gas from inactive landfill sites will form a part of that, given that it's quite a large figure in the table of abatements.
Yes, and some landfill sites at the moment capture gas and some don't, and some have flares, and we have to clearly achieve those targets through understanding how we can improve that, and that's why that report's been carried out.
Thank you for that. A shift into the deep blue sea. Claudia Beamish.
Cabinet Secretary, as the convener says, we're going to shift to the deep blue sea with good reason, I think, in relation to the RPP2, because there has been disappointment expressed, and I agree with that disappointment about the lack of information and really any detail in the draft document about marine issues. And I know that the fact that you didn't mention in your opening remarks anything about marine issues doesn't mean that you know you're not thinking about these issues. But I do wonder, and well, I'll be open about it. I didn't really know until quite recently myself what blue carbon was, and so I've looked into it in a little bit of detail. And I would have hoped that there might be the possibility, at least in proposals, of looking at that possibility of sequestration through blue carbon. And if you'll bear with me, I'd just like to draw your attention to Scottish Natural Heritage's evidence to the committee, in which they say, whilst woodlands and peatlands are acknowledged to play an important role in carbon mitigation, it has more recently been recognised that marine habitats may also have a significant role. And you will, of course, know that there's been recent research by the Association of Marine Science into the current status and knowledge about this. So I wonder the degree to which, because SNH is looking at these possibilities, the degree to which, at least within proposals, this might be properly reflected within the final document.
Yes, and like you, blue carbon is a phrase which is now part of the lexicon, which I only became familiar with in recent times as well. And we're going to hear a lot more of that in the years ahead, I'm sure, blue carbon. I could talk about this issue because it's a very interesting issue for quite a while, but the key point here is that we do not have data on the contribution of blue carbon. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's a relatively new area. And when we're publishing a document with tables, with all the figures of how we're going to get to our targets, we couldn't put a target there for blue carbon. And that's perhaps why it's not covered in the document. But I do take the point that, you know, it should perhaps have a reference, and we should look at that. There's a lot of work going to be carried out by our agencies over, I think this year actually, 2013, 2014, into trying to understand more about blue carbon on our seabeds and what contribution that makes in terms of being carbon sinks and, you know, other factors. So it's a very exciting area actually. It obviously is very linked into many other policy initiatives at the moment, like the Marine Act, the Future Marine Protected Area Network, and what role that should play in protecting blue carbon. So whilst our existing policies recognise the need for our marine environment to mitigate climate change and to play a role in our climate change policies, just the lack of data at the moment and evidence is why it's not in the tables. I think you want to add one point.
I just wanted to add a point, hopefully to just add a little bit of some of the reasoning and thinking behind why blue carbon isn't in RPP2, because it is something that we approached our colleagues in Marine Scotland to discuss when we were thinking about what should feature amongst the list of proposals and policies. And it is very much that we don't have the data to project off what the abatement potential from blue carbon from marine ecosystems might be. And this committee's discussed on a number of times the journey we've come on and our understanding of what might be potentially achieved through peatland restoration. It's quite a similar story for blue carbon in that a few years ago we knew very little about what might be achieved from peat. And we know a lot more now, but we're not at the end of that journey. We're even further behind on blue carbon, and we didn't want to put something into the document which would have effectively been a fantasy. It would have been an invention of numbers, which wouldn't have been appropriate. An additional sort of technical point is the things that are proposals in the document. We have quite a specific definition in terms of RPP2 in that they're things which we understand enough to have an abatement figure projected out for proposals. If we did this proposal, we believe we could get abatement in the region of X, Y, or Z. We don't have that data for blue carbon, and importantly, blue carbon also isn't part of the international framework for reporting on greenhouse gas abatement emissions. We've just got the movement internationally to adopt wetland management, which includes peatland restoration. Blue carbon is another step beyond that. So if we were to include something now, it would be going quite a way beyond the international framework for reporting these kinds of emissions and emissions reductions. We could do that under the Act, but it would be going out on a limb somewhat, and we would prefer to stick much more closely to international methodology, so we're doing things in a way which matches up, internationally and is responsible.
And I'm now kicking myself under the table, as you always do at committee, because Andrew gave me that analogy about peatland yesterday, and I said I'm going to use that at committee, and I forgot. So it's a very good analogy, though. It's just where peatland was a few years ago is where we are now with blue carbon.
I mean through the convener, if I could just sort of explore that a little further with you, Cabinet Secretary, because it would seem that there are other issues that are highlighted in RPP2, which are, say, technical issues, which are after 2020, which come into proposals and are tabulated. And we've had discussion in relation to agriculture and land use specifically about things that we don't know about yet. And that has definitely been highlighted to us, So I really do want us to, if possible, look at this as closely as we can and to look at what possible funding might be needed in terms of research, for instance, for the future, because there's the salt marshes, and I have to look at it still, the salt marshes and seagrass beds and kelp forests. And as you say, that does relate to marine protected areas and should maybe be taken into that. So I do think there needs to be some sort of a marker in the final report that these issues need to be addressed, and it really is fundamental, and I feel quite strongly about it. And in that context, I do have another question, which is, could you, Cabinet Secretary, update the committee on the likely publication date of the National Marine Plan, and how this could or will incorporate some concepts of blue carbon, although I somewhat suspect that it's going to be a little early for it to actually incorporate anything more than the concepts.
The National Marine Plan will be published for consultation in the summer of this year, and it will be published alongside the sectorial plans for marine renewables and at the same time as the MPA network as well. And that's because they're all very closely linked, and we wanted these synergies to be out there at the same time. So we're not having a debate over the impact of marine renewables, but then there's an MPA debate going on, and there's the National Marine Plan, how it all fits together. So we're having all of these in tandem because obviously they're very closely related, and we want to have that debate and make sure each one takes on board the other one. So on all of these plans of these three areas that will be consulted upon, they all take into account carbon and climate change issues. So, for instance, the sectorial plans for marine renewables, clearly that could involve the laying of pipes or pipelines and cables. So if cables are going to impact on blue carbon, I'm not saying we're advanced enough to know that at the moment for next summer, I'm just saying that they do take account of that.
So could I just ask you one further question, just highlighting from RSPB's evidence an issue in relation to sensitive marine areas, whereby they recommend that the RPP2 should, they say, and I would ask you the question, be explicit in the means by which sensitive marine areas would be protected from marine developments, particularly in the context of marine energy. And you've sort of answered that question, but again, there are a number of, like Environment Link and RSPB and other organisations that really have a concern about how this opportunity, which I completely take your point, was the opportunity with peatlands, and I do recognise what Andrew Henderson's highlighting about the international obligations, and the science isn't quite there yet. But how are we going to do this? You know, there really is a concern and an opportunity.
It is a big opportunity, and I'll certainly reflect on that. I'm pretty sympathetic to having a reference to that in the plan. Again, because we don't know what the contribution would be to our targets, you know, we could be open to accusation of saying things that, you know, might not make any contribution. So we've just got to draw that parallel. And obviously, well, yeah, the National Marine Plan getting for consultation is an opportunity to have that debate as well and make sure that's all in there. We didn't have a marine section of the RPP2 because quite clearly many of the marine issues are split across various parts of the RPP2, i.e. marine renewables is under energy, and we didn't want to repeat and, you know, be accused of double counting and anything. So if you think about it, there could have been a marine section of the RPP2, but the decision was taken not to have that because it would have to bring together things that were already in other parts of the documents. But maybe in the future that's something to look at.
I think Cabinet Secretary might be reassuring to a lot of people who have concerns about carbon and the contribution that can be made through the marine environment, that at least to reference that and point out that it is highlighted in other areas might be helpful.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary and your team, for the evidence. It gives us a practical understanding of how this has been drawn up, and indeed can allow us to give constructive and hopefully useful comments in the process of reaching the final documents. So thank you for coming along after a busy week. We too have had 2 meetings this week on these subjects, and we have a lot to mull over. So at this point, I would close the meeting. Thank you. And at next week's meeting, the committee will hear from the Rent Review Working Group with regard to their report on rent reviews, and we shall also look at a sign-off of the committee's letter to the Government on biodiversity. So thank you, members, for your attention, and we'll finish now.